Who were the Elohim and the Nephilim? To answer this curious question, we need to look at the backdrop of the major biblical narrative. Like so many other questions on this channel, they're a little harder to tackle. In order to understand them, we often need to put the background of the major biblical story behind it. Only then can we see these questions in the light of what is actually going on in the context. And in the case of the Elohim and the Nephilim, it's no different. So, what is that major story? As we've talked about before, the major story is this: that God created the world and he created free will creatures so that they might choose to be in a loving relationship with him. They ultimately use their free will to rebel against him. Instead of choosing to love him and walk with him, they choose to try to be the gods of their own life, to seek glory and honor and success and happiness for themselves apart from God. So, in other words, they sin, and through that, they bring guilt upon themselves. They're deserving of eternal punishment and separation from God. They could do nothing to get back into relationship with God. So, God, rich in mercy, came to earth as Jesus. He lives a perfect life, sinless life. He dies on the cross, he suffers in our place, and he pays for our sin. But he also rises from the dead, proving to be God and having victory, conquering over sin, death, and the powers of darkness that wage war against him. So anyone who trusts in him and enters into relationship with him through his sacrifice will be forgiven and enter into unending life with their creator. One day he will return and judge the living and the dead. He will escort all those who've trusted in him into unending life with himself. Those who've rejected him, well, they stand condemned already because of their sin, and they will enter into unending, permanent separation from God and his goodness. Now, in this grand story, we know that God created two personal creations with free will, to choose him or to choose to reject him. And they are spiritual beings and human beings. Now, some of the spiritual beings fell with the devil as their leader, as we read about in the Bible. And they've waged war against God ever since, desiring to attack him and attack what he loves most, the people he made in his image. But God also created mankind in his image to rule over his creation. We read that in Genesis. He created us to have dominion over the earth that he made. However, in Genesis, we see that the first human beings are tempted by the devil, and as such, we lost our place, and he gained it, becoming the prince of this world. We have been at war with him ever since. But good news is, God had a plan, promising that the seed of the woman would grow and crush the head of the serpent. So naturally, the powers of darkness and the devil would henceforth wage war and attack the seed of the woman, undermining God's intended design for marriage, family, and life ever since. So, with that background, an introduction to the biblical narrative in the background, we can move forward. What do we pull out of this grand story? We see that God is the maker, he's the only independent one. Everything else that exists had a beginning and was created. Created beings were made with free will because God wanted them to have the chance to love him, which can only happen by free creatures. The free will was abused, unfortunately, in both scenarios by some of the heavenly beings, the spiritual beings, and by the human beings. It transformed some of the perfectly heavenly beings into demented and twisted creatures who hate God and want to hurt him in any way that they can. It also transformed perfect human beings who were living in paradise into marred and twisted people in a broken world, separated from God, struggling with sin, and deserving of judgment. The demonic powers wage war against God and the humans he so dearly loves, trying to keep them separated. But God rises triumphantly, conquering through Jesus' perfect life, death, and resurrection. He now uses his redeemed people to regain the territories of the earth for his glory and transformation. So that's the backdrop. And with that in place, we can now answer the questions: who are the Elohim and who are the Nephilim? So let's start with Elohim. The Hebrew word Elohim quite literally just means God. It's used to describe both deity and creator, but also other false substitutes and spiritual beings seeking his worship. God uses a variety of titles throughout the Old Testament, Elohim just being one of them. It has to do with the fact that he is a spiritual being, of which there are also others that we're told about. Christian theologian Michael Heiser describes that the word Elohim is used to describe God, the heavenly hosts, other spiritual beings, and even those who've departed, to describe that they are disembodied spirits. So, as such, it's more of a descriptive term rather than a title that's only attributed to God. That being said, that's not to say that God is just one among many big G gods. Instead, it's saying that he's the only big G god among many small g gods. In other words, they're all disembodied spirits, yes, which makes them similar, but there's also a categorical difference. There's a hierarchy in that God, the creator, that disembodied spirit, is the only God. He's the only independent one. He's the creator of all things. And that while the other small g gods are disembodied spirits, they're real, but they're also fellow creations. They're not other gods alongside this God. So, though they're all called gods, there's a categorical distinction between creator and the lesser spiritual beings which were created. A great depiction of this is the occasion of 1 Samuel chapter 5, where God's Ark of the Covenant is captured by the Philistines. The Philistines capture it from the Israelites and they take it into their own temple. They put it next to the shrine of Dagon, their god, again, Elohim. And what happens? They leave and they come back later, and what do they find? Their statue of Dagon, their god, is face down in front of the Ark of the Covenant, representing God's holy presence. And so they're like, whoa, that's weird. They stand up their God, back up on its feet, and then they leave. And then they come back later again and they walk in, and the statue of Dagon now is broken apart. And they look over by the doorway, and there it's just the head of Dagon and his arms. It's literally trying to escape the presence of God. So, though these both were physical manifestations and representations of these two disembodied spirits, we see there's a hierarchy between the creator, the one true God, and this small g God, this other disembodied spirit, which was seeking the worship of people. It couldn't stand in the presence of God, and it tried to escape. That also might have something to say about the holiness of the one true God and the wickedness that of this other small g God that couldn't even be in the presence of the true God. So that's a great depiction of the difference, that there's a categorical and hierarchical difference between these two quote unquote gods or Elohims. But it also represents how these other Elohims, these fallen angelic beings, are trying to receive the worship of Israel and these other nations throughout the Old Testament, drawing their hearts away from the one true God. This foreign worship also and always results in ritual cutting, shrine prostitution, and burning of one's children in the fire, just to name a few of the regular practices seen amongst these nations that worshipped other Elohim. Now, this should sound familiar at this point to the grand story that we opened this video with. There's an enemy which is jealous of God, seeks to deceive humans he made, and attacks the seed of the woman, being sexuality and children. That's the story of the fallen heavenly beings which rebelled against God because they were jealous, and as they fall away, they try to attack God in any way they can, stealing his worship, and they try to deceive the humans he's made, who they should be worshiping the one true God, but they're trying to deceive them and keep them away from God, keep them separated, and ultimately wage war on the seed of woman, which promised to bring about the conqueror, which would defeat them. That fits right in line with that grand story. So, in short, the Elohim are other spiritual beings which God made, sometimes themselves referred to as gods. The ones who have fallen, because again, they haven't all fallen, some of them are still faithful and remain faithful to God in heaven, choosing not to rebel, but to continue to trust and obey God. But the ones who have fallen no longer obey and serve God. Instead, they attempt to steal his worship, deceive his people, and attack the seed of woman. So that opens up this conversation explaining who the Elohim are, how God is an Elohim, but how he is the creator, and that these other Elohim, these other disembodied spirits, are fellow creations, and some of them, have rebelled and try to deceive us. And this brings us to the subject of who the Nephilim are. Genesis chapter 6 is the opening conversation about the Nephilim, and it describes the sons of God who went to lay with the daughters of men, producing children called Nephilim. They're described as heroes of old, men of renown. Now, the interesting thing is that this is Genesis 6, verse 4. The very next verse is what opens up the flood narrative. It says that God looked down on creation, he saw the wickedness of the earth. And that prompted him to want to start over, to cleanse it. He saw that it was awful. And so he brought about a flood that wiped out all of creation except Noah and his family. And so he started the human population anew. Now, it must have been pretty bad to want to destroy life and start over. And this is what we read right after this little section on the Nephilim. Now, there are two primary views on who the Nephilim are. One view states that the sons of God refer to the priestly line of Seth. Remember Adam and Eve, they have two sons, Cain and Abel. Cain is angry and jealous because his sacrifice is rejected while Abel's is accepted by God. So he murders his brother Abel. And then Adam and Eve, they mourn, but God grants them another son, Seth, and he's seen as a special line. But so now there's Cain and Seth. Now some say that his line was more of like a priestly line. It was the chosen line from Adam and Eve, whereas Cain's line was the rejected line. Following that narrative, they say that Seth's line, that's the sons of God. And so when it says that the sons of God intermarried with the daughters of Eve, they're saying that Seth's line and Cain's line, they intermarried and had offspring. Nevertheless, this does not seem to make sense of the fact that the offspring is being pointed out by the writer as something significant, something different, calling them heroes of men, people of legend. With limited population, it would make sense that they were intermarrying and that wouldn't be something that would bring about a different kind of offspring that would be categorically different and significant as opposed to the rest of the population. As such, the view that seems to make more sense of the grand story that we've talked about is that the sons of God refer to spiritual creatures, spiritual beings, fallen Elohim, which once again we see are waging war on the seed of woman, creating demonic offspring. In the Old Testament, primarily, the title of sons of God refers to angelic beings. We don't get this title given to humans until the New Testament, following Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, which gives us the Holy Spirit as we enter this new life through baptism, marking us anew, giving us new life, and as the Holy Spirit comes and dwells inside us, only then are we given the right to be called sons of God. So, given that, it would make more sense that we would put this in line with the usage in the Old Testament of sons of God, which has to do with heavenly hosts, angelic beings, and the Elohim. And this continues to make sense when we read more about the Nephilim talked about throughout the Old Testament. It goes on. There are more stories of these extraordinary people called giants. Their height is not the only thing that makes them unique. Hugh Ross explains that their incredible strength points to a supernatural element. He explains that the bigger someone is, the taller they are, the greater the gravitational pull. It's for this reason that the human body only gets so large before it becomes extremely clumsy and just not very practical to use. He explains that it usually caps around 7 feet. Once it gets much bigger than that, you just can't do very much. You get too clumsy and the gravitational pull is just too large. He argues that if someone were up to 9 feet or more, it'd be hard for them to even get up from a wheelchair. Yet we read that these men, the shortest of them, Goliath being one of the shortest, was 9 feet, but they're even larger, and that these were mighty men. They had incredible strength. And for them to be that tall and that large and be able to do all of this, he argues that requires a supernatural element of strength, defying the laws of nature. These giants are much larger, fully capable, and able to lift hundreds of pounds in armory and weaponry. Therefore, they are extraordinarily large and strong, the heroes of men, once again, which is what it says in that passage from Genesis. So these encounters continue to happen throughout the Old Testament. Numbers 13:13 states that there the people saw the sons of Anak, who were descended from the Nephilim. Entering the promised land, we see that this is what the spies claim they saw. They said that the people in that land were giants. Moreover, we see David fights one of them, going back to Goliath. It says that Goliath was a descendant of the Anakites. And in fact, according to the Jewish writings, David and his mighty men killed off the last of them. Each encounter with the Anakites and Nephilim, sometimes called Anakim or Rephaim, all of these men, and they were all men, which is interesting, they were all depicted as evil, twisted against the God of creation, and waging war against his chosen people. Now that sounds familiar, doesn't it? As such, the view that seems to make the most sense biblically with the narrative we've talked about is not that this was just another human line of Seth's and Cain's offspring mixing, but rather that there's a supernatural element here. After all, God brings about a global flood. It must have been something really weird going on there. It makes sense that the Nephilim, later described as giants, is the twisted consequence of fallen Elohim, disembodied spirits, demons encountering willing human women, creating offspring of unusual size and strength, each of which we know of was evil. But is there any extra biblical evidence for their existence? That would confirm that this is the right interpretation of these passages. Now, certainly from paintings and stories of cultures around the world, we see gods of men and giants leading and receiving worship of human civilizations. Cultures around the world, from the ancient Greeks to the Romans to the Egyptians, around the world, cultures separated from one another. They each have these stories of mighty heroes, of men of renown, giants of extraordinary strength, each being considered a god or receiving the worship. That seems to confirm that there's something weird going on in life's history, that maybe they weren't all just made up stories. It seems that myths always have at their basis an element of truth. Stories come from somewhere. And if these stories exist around the world throughout different cultures separated from one another, perhaps there's something to that. Perhaps the giants, the Nephilim, this mixing of demonic disembodied spirits and willing human women, perhaps actually happened. And perhaps that's why a flood was so necessary to start anew, at which God finished up through King David and his mighty men, wiping out the last of them in the land. In addition to that cultural apologetic for the existence of the Nephilim, we also see archaeological evidence for their existence. For example, in Israel itself, massive weaponry has been unearthed, including massive spearheads up to 26 inches long. Now, if you want to know why that's so weird, the average spearhead of the age is only 6 inches. 26 inches long is much larger than that. And that's so much heavier. You have to add a spear, a staff to that. The spearhead would have belonged to a humongous, a colossal human being. And this actually goes right in line with the Old Testament, which talks about these giants having spearheads, comparing the weight and the size. That no mere human would have been able to hold this and use this. It would have been too heavy and too large. Additionally, large skeletons have been unearthed around the world, revealing unusually large skulls, finger bones, and belong to bodies well over 9 feet tall. All of these findings seem to make sense of this claim in the Old Testament that there truly were these heroes of men, these giants, these men of renown, which in the biblical narrative are the product of fallen Elohim engaging willing human women and producing an unholy offspring, ultimately continuing the demonic purpose of continuing to separate people from the one true God, trusting in false powers and giving them their attention, honor, and worship. Now, the point of this discussion, however, is not to bring glory and even interest into the dark activities of demonic hosts. That has not been my purpose. Instead, I want to expose their failure and humiliating and ultimate defeat, helping believers to be wise and discerning and bold in their faith. For as Paul explained in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12, the war that we wage is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. The devil stole our intended place as the ruler of this world. He's the prince of the world. But Jesus, the seed of the woman, came and grew And he lived the perfect life. Despite the devil trying to tempt him in the wilderness, he remained unstained. He lived a perfect life, humiliating the devil. Then, in Jesus' own humiliation and point of surrender and sacrifice, he suffered and died for us on the cross. And then he rose again, rising victorious. Through that, Jesus defeated the devil's claim to this world. And now, with his spirit within us, as we've trusted in him and entered this rebirth and new life with Jesus, our creator, we are on a conquest to regain the world, taking his transformation and transformative gospel into all the earth, redeeming every nation and tribe and tongue to worship the one true God. And then God will restore his creation to its intended function. And as it says in Revelation chapter 22, and we will reign forever. So join the conquest, for the war has been won. So guys, that's my video on who are the Elohim and the Nephilim. I hope that diving into more of the history and the context of these mysterious verses, they're kind of spread out throughout the Old Testament. I hope that it makes more sense of these disembodied beings that God has created with free will. Some continue to serve him and trust him and obey him. Some have fallen and rejected him, the devil and his demonic powers. And they've waged war against humanity, especially against the seed of woman, because it was through the seed of woman God promised to bring about a victorious Savior who would crush the head of the serpent. And that helps us make sense of the Nephilim, which again would represent this war that's waged against the seed of the woman, attempting to attack God's intended design for marriage, for family, and for children. And that's what we find in the worship of these false deities around the world. It always comes with messed up practices that do not fall in line with God's design, and ultimately they steal us of the joy and the fulfillment that God has created in this. And ultimately, they try to keep us separated from the worship of the one true God. So my ultimate exhortation from this discussion is that, look, they've been doing the same thing since the beginning. Even in our culture, there's an attack on God's intended purpose for marriage, for family, and for life and for children. Whether that be the slaughter of children in the Old Testament, or whether that be abortion in our own country. We need to come back to God's value of life, his intended purpose, and to worshiping him instead of these false gods that try to steal our attention and keep us separated from him. There's a real enemy out there. But Jesus, his victory over the enemy is just as real. And because of that, we have nothing to fear. Though the war we wage is not against flesh and blood, but against the dark powers of this world and of heavenly places, he's victorious. And as such, we need to man up. We need to embrace the purpose God created us with, to have dominion over the earth. And we need to engage in the conquest for the nations of the earth, to worship the one true God, and to experience the love and the transformation which he has offered us in his grace through the sacrifice of his son, Jesus. And with him, we will rule forever and ever, which is what we read in Revelation. So may this be an encouragement to you. May it embolden you in your faith. And may it get you down on your knees to fight this battle through prayer and through intentional engagement of the world around you, sharing the good news of the gospel and humiliating the devil by exposing his weak attempts, which Jesus has left obsolete for those who trust in him. If you found this video helpful, then please share it with someone that you think would also be interested to learn more about the Elohim and the Nephilim and Jesus' ultimate victory and humiliation of them. And for more content just like this, subscribe down below. I release a new video every Saturday. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time.